Much, Justin, for that great introduction. Again, my name is Gerardo Sandoval, and I'm here at the University of Oregon. I'll just give you a little bit of background in terms of how I got involved in this project, because I'm actually not a transportation researcher. I do research on community development issues and neighborhood change. But I think that's actually, and I'm actually a very qualitative researcher as well. But I think that actually is pretty interesting for this kind of work, because I think it kind of brings in like a new element of understanding these types of large-scale projects and how they affect immigrant communities. So I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this project. I actually grew up in MacArthur Park, so I know this community quite well. Excuse me, I immigrated to Los Angeles when I was 6 years old, and then I did all my public schooling in LA, and then after that I went to Northern California for all my college. But I kind of saw how a lot of changes were occurring in this community, and that really got me interested in pursuing, kind of studying the neighborhood. So I did my dissertation on MacArthur Park, on the redevelopment aspects of it. Then I went on and I wrote a book on the revitalization of MacArthur Park. But then I got interested in how the subway there actually served as a catalyst for a lot of the revitalization that occurred in the community. So that's how I got into more of the transportation aspects of the study. And then I decided to compare what was happening in MacArthur Park to some other TODs around the country. And kind of one of the most famous kind of TODs around is the Fruitvale TOD. So I decided to compare it to Fruitvale. And so I don't know if you had a chance to read the report that I completed, but that there's a lot of, since this is a very qualitative study, there's a lot more details that I get into in the report. So I'd encourage you to download that NITC report and get more details. But that's one comparison. And in a way, this study is actually not, it's still a work in progress, because I have more case studies that I'm doing. I'm currently studying another TOD in San Diego, so Barrio Logan, and then another TOD, actually a couple of ones in East Los Angeles, so the Aliso Pico one, and also the Plaza Mariachi. And my goal is really to kind of write a book about all these different case studies, put everything together in a few years. But I'll get into kind of the study. And really, I think there's this, when you're studying neighborhoods, you kind of have to understand like what the structural problem is in many of these, when it comes to these issues. And I think the big structural problem when it comes to redevelopment is that when people try to improve these low-income areas, that usually and frequently leads to displacement of the current residents. Again, historically, that's been the case. So then you have to start asking yourself, okay, so if planners, transportation planners and so forth are trying to supposedly improve these communities, why is it that many times, that just kind of leads to displacement? So that's really like the kind of key issue that I'm really interested in, and a lot of my work kind of speaks to how that plays out. If you look at this kind of question historically, you start seeing that there's a pattern here, okay? And especially when it comes to large-scale transportation infrastructure projects. If you look at the kind of projects that occurred during urban renewal, especially in African American communities, a lot of those large projects kind of led to the destruction of those communities. It cut them off from a lot of opportunities. It forcefully displaced people from their homes. And just to give you some examples, like in East Los Angeles, right, there's about 4 freeways that basically intersect and cut that community off. In many ways, the freeways define especially Boyle Heights. Okay? So that's one example. The other one is Barrio Logan, so Chicano Park in San Diego. That neighborhood used to be called Logan Heights, and they built Interstate 5, so they cut it in half, and they built the Coronado Bridge, and so that cut it into 4 pieces. Okay? And then finally people got fed up when they were trying to install a police station underneath the bridge, and they took over it and they created Chicano Park. That's another story for another day. there's actually a TOD that's being built in that neighborhood, which is what I'm studying right now. So really I'm interested in how these TODs, particularly in MacArthur Park and in Fruitvale, can serve as catalysts for neighborhood efforts. Because if you think about the historical kind of trends here, of that lead to kind of these the displacement, I'm trying to understand whether planners are trying to actually improve these communities, and so forth. After conducting my literature review, I think at the end of the day, there's still very little that we know about the benefits that TOD brings to low-income communities. I mean, and the interesting part is that as cities become more, trying to be more sustainable and increase density and so forth, there's going to be more TODs built in these types of communities. So I think it's important to really understand, what's going on here. The purpose of the study is to better understand how TODs shape the revitalization efforts occurring in low-income Latino communities, where TOD is a major factor in revitalization efforts. So all of my case studies are in neighborhoods where the TOD has been the catalyst for spurring neighborhood revitalization and redevelopment. Okay, so it's not, it's the revitalization is not just because of the TODs, but it's kind of a major factor in that. The aim is to provide a comprehensive description of these two projects to help transportation planners better understand the possibilities that TOD has in revitalizing low-income immigrants without widespread displacement. And I'll talk more about that issue. So when you're doing qualitative research, it's really important to understand the context in communities and in the areas. Basically going beyond the numbers and really understanding what's going on in this place. So I'll introduce you a little bit to MacArthur Park, and then we'll get into the Fruitvale, and then we'll get into the projects, and then I'll share, some of the literature and then my findings. But MacArthur Park is a neighborhood that's about a mile west of downtown Los Angeles. Okay, it was originally a very kind of high-end neighborhood with beautiful kind of public space and a park. But it ran into some hard times, and there's been a lot of redevelopment in the area in the last 15 years. This picture shows the site of the TOD project. So you see that it's right near the lake, and it's pretty much in the center of the neighborhood. It really served as a catalyst to open up more development into the neighborhood. It's the first subway line to open outside of the central business district. So actually the planners, and I've looked through, the plans, and when they were designing the subway, they really had, they really wanted to change kind of the social dynamics in the neighborhood in MacArthur Park. So the TOD really called for higher end condominiums, higher end retail, and it really wasn't kind of paying attention to it wasn't aimed for benefiting the community that was there in MacArthur Park. So that was kind of a key component to keep in mind. The neighborhood at this time was mostly low-income Latino neighborhood. There's a lot of difficulties in the neighborhood. There was issues with the police. The Rampart Police Station was this kind of the least funded police station in LA, but had like the most amount of crimes that they had to deal with. There was a lot of corruption in that precinct, and so it was actually investigated by the FBI, and some of the police officers got thrown in jail. So there was all these types of issues. Now, MacArthur Park was also basically the home of the MS-13 kind of transnational gang. That's where it started. So at one point, MacArthur Park had the highest homicide rates in Los Angeles. It was the hub of kind of drug activity for LA. That's not really the case anymore, but that's kind of just to introduce you to the context in the community. It's very much a Latino immigrant neighborhood. So here I just kind of try to paint a picture of some of the key kind of demographics of the neighborhood, and then I'll kind of compare these to the Fruitvale because they're somewhat similar. If you take a look here, these numbers are from 2013, so it's still very much a Latino community. So 77% of residents in MacArthur Park are Latino. If you dig in a little deeper, you see that almost 30% are from Guatemala, 32% from Mexico and El Salvador. So it's really like a Mexican kind of Central American community. And also 63% are foreign-born residents, foreign-born. And so it's really an immigrant neighborhood. This other map really shows, if you compare it to the rest of the city, you know, MacArthur Park is really a kind of a gateway community. So a lot of recently immigrated people, Latinos, that come into LA, they'll live in MacArthur Park for a few years, and then they'll move out into other parts of the neighborhood. So Fruitvale actually has kind of similar characteristics. I'll get into those. But if we talk about build capital, we're talking about the Transit Village. Okay? And the Transit Village in Fruitvale, like I said, is at this point is a pretty well-known TOD. It's kind of highlighted as you know, as one of you know, as an example of a very successful transit-oriented development. But the story behind there is interesting. So BART was planning on building a large parking structure that was basically going to be built where the previous parking was available in the community. So if you look at the BART station, they were going to build the new BART parking structure that was going to cut off International Street. International Street is about 50 yards north of the station, and International Street has a lot of the Latino kind of small businesses in the neighborhood. So BART was planning on putting the subway station right there, and that would have led to, you know, that basically the center of the community of the neighborhood, International Boulevard, being cut off from access to BART. So the community opposed this. The opposition was led by the Unity Council, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Unity Council later. But you know, Unity Council has a strong history of activism in the neighborhood. You go back to the Chicano movement in the 1960s. They have this Latino pan-ethnic umbrella. They used to be called the Spanish-speaking Unity Council. And actually, it's interesting they changed their name to Unity Council. Later I'll show you some of the demographics. But the Fruitvale was actually a pretty diverse community. But Unity Council had a very strong neighborhood ties. So then they put pressure on BART, and some of the local politicians helped. And so they were able to fund, basically become the developers. They're a community corporation, and they were able to basically be the lead developers on the project. I've seen different numbers of the total cost actually, but from some of their documents, it's about $52 million, and they had 30 different sources, so it became very complicated kind of sourcing mechanism. A lot of this complexity was carried out by the efforts of their key leaders, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. One interesting thing to note is that when they first decided to change the initial plans in the neighborhood, they actually got the help of the UC Berkeley Department of Planning, which is my alma mater, and they worked with Professor Ed Blakely. He did like a leakage study where he was, they figured out that a lot of the retail was leaving a lot of the potential retail money was leaving the neighborhood, and so that was one of the initial kind of visions that they had for the TOD, is that they try to keep as much, you know, retail money in the neighborhood as possible, and that's why I think they've always been focused on the link between International Street and the businesses there, and the connection that they can do to the BART station. So just a little bit more information on the Fruitvale. About half of the population there are Latinos, but it's actually kind of a multicultural community if you look at the numbers there. But still, almost half of that population is foreign born, so they're immigrants as well. So similar characteristics to to MacArthur Park, although I would say the Fruitvale district is a little bit more multi-ethnic. Okay, let's talk about the project features. So they're very different projects. So the key difference between the MacArthur Park TOD and the Fruitvale TOD is that the Fruitvale TOD was a complete kind of package, okay, and it was led by this very strong community development corporation, okay, so the Unity Council. Whereas the MacArthur Park ones, that was really a TOD that kind of came out of a backlash from the community as well. From the they were doing the top-down thing, and then it became kind of its sole kind of project that then linked to the rest of the redevelopment that was already occurring in the neighborhood. So the MacArthur Park apartments focus a lot on affordable housing, whereas the Fruitvale Transit focuses on a lot of other elements. But interestingly enough, the Fruitvale Transit District had a lot of difficulties trying to get their retail together and a lot of their community services filled and so forth. But now they're kind of up at full steam. But I think that's one key difference between both of them. So if you look at the MacArthur Park, there are about 90 affordable apartments right now, 50,000 square feet of retail, and so forth. And then they have some future plans for their second phase. When I wrote my first book, that first phase hadn't even been completed yet. So it was interesting because afterwards they actually were. The project is only a few years old, but in terms of the housing, that's totally filled, and there's and so they're looking ahead to do a second phase. So the Fruitvale Transit District, the Fruitvale project, 47 mixed income residents, a lot more retail, a lot more community service, and so forth. And then there's a lot of the social services that were ultimately put into the project as well. So there's a La Clínica Community Health Center, and that's a very interesting community health center. I mean, they service a lot of clients all over the region, and they were like the key service kind of anchor to the whole project. So they really took a took a lead on that. I was able to talk to some of the key planners that work with that community center. They have a Head Start child care facility, a senior center facility that's actually very multicultural. They have a charter school that works with low-income youth who encourage them to go on to college, kind of a college prep one. They have a public library that the city actually, I think they paid like 20 years of the rent to help with some of the financing around the project. And then they have a huge phase 2 that they're currently working on right now, that they're basically trying to focus more on apartments. And when I spoke to some of the key players in this project, that was one thing they said, is that maybe they should have started off with the affordable, the apartments first, because it did take a lot of effort to fill the other things. But at this point, they both seem to be doing quite well. Okay, so this is the literature. I'm not going to get too much into the literature. If you want to dig a little deeper, you're welcome to read the report, but there are a few key aspects that I wanted to point to here. I'm not going to, I think, most of you are transportation planners, so you know what transit-oriented development is. I had to kind of get acquainted with it. But what's interesting is that this definition kind of keeps changing. The key person is Robert Cervera, who's also was at Berkeley. If you look at this definition, TOD as public transportation investments linked to heavy rail subways that aim to encourage housing around the transit station and invest in public amenities adjacent to the station. So that's kind of the definition I'm taking. It's a simplistic one. Like I said, it kind of changes, but for the purposes of this project, that's what I'm looking at. The other literature I'm really focused on is the transportation justice literature. And what's interesting about, if you look at like the civil rights movement, a lot of the civil rights movement was focused on transportation issues. And it's kind of obvious once I read that, but as I dig a little deeper into it, I was really surprised that not a lot of more planners kind of know this or realize this. But you're talking about the bus boycotts, you're talking about segregation around public transit. So a lot of that movement comes from this. So the key book there is Just Transportation by Bullard, if you're interested in that. So Bullard has this interesting definition of how he looks at equity issues and inequality. So he looks at it from three perspectives. So the procedural inequality. So this is where attention is given to process, okay, by which transportation decisions take place. So basically that asks who is involved in decision making. Okay, the geographic inequality focuses on the distributional spatial aspects, both positive and negative, of transportation investments or disinvestments. So where are these projects located, basically? And then social inequality. So the distributional impacts of policies on various population groups related to transportation decisions. So for our purposes, the question there is, do TODs just contribute to displacement, right? So you're talking about process, you're talking about location, and then you're talking about the impacts of these rails. So that's why I really like his framing in terms of justice issues. Mostly he focuses on race, but we can use it. We can use his framing here. So at the end of the day, transportation justice deals with the distributional impacts of transportation decisions and the inequality that exists between transportation nodes that impact low-income communities and communities of color because of their marginalization. And I think kind of the key the debate around TODs and low-income neighborhoods has to do with displacement and gentrification, whether it's revitalization, those kinds of issues. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger deal as more of these TODs are put into these kinds of neighborhoods. I mean, there are other justice questions you could ask, right? I mean, some people critique TODs in the first place, saying, why are we putting millions of dollars into these projects when we could be supporting buses, right? But that's another discussion. So we'll leave those important discussions, but we'll leave those for another time. Right now, I'm focusing on I guess my premise is that these TODs are happening. They are being built. They're going to continually be built. So I'm trying to understand how we can make these TODs a little bit more helpful for the people that currently live in these communities. So my main question, how might low-income Latino communities benefit from large-scale TOD projects? Right? So what are the risks to these neighborhoods if TODs are linked to neighborhood revitalization? And ultimately, what are the neighborhood characteristics that exist within the Latino communities that can help mitigate those risks and create more equitable outcomes? So that's an important piece, and I think that's the piece where I can really contribute towards this debate and these discussions, that it's not really like a cookie cutter kind of recipe out there. Is that in order to really make these projects work, you really have to understand the context in these neighborhoods, and if we can identify some characteristics that exist within, for me, within Latino communities that help them absorb these projects better, then we might be able to get some equitable outcomes out of these big projects. I'm not going to get too much into theory because I know most of you are practitioners, but I think it's important that you know kind of how I'm filtering my analysis. So I'm kind of filtering this through the community capitals framework. Okay, this is Cornelia Flora. She's a rural sociologist. She studies kind of asset-based approaches in rural communities. And so her theory looks at how different forms of capital exist in different communities. So she talks about build capital. So for us, that's TODs, right? I mean, you can't get, it's a huge infrastructural project that's being put into these communities. We're talking about financial capital. Here I'm looking at Latino small businesses and also informal capital that exists in these neighborhoods. Political capital, here progressive Latino politicians, network community-based organizations, and then cultural capital, which here I'm looking more as kind of placemaking issues. And that's a big issue in Latino communities. How do Latinos go about creating a sense of place and empowerment from that sense of place? Okay, so let me get into the case studies now that I've kind of walked you through all the other framing, which I think is kind of critical. Okay, so again, I'm going to look at these projects from those different forms of capital. So political capital, cultural capital, and financial forms of capital. And in MacArthur Park, this is a picture of the completed TOD here. So you've got the apartments there, the retail on the bottom, which you can't really see, and then it's linked to the subway. But initially, when they were planning the TOD, they the planners ran into resistance. And the key resistance came from County Supervisor Gloria Molina. Okay, so we're talking about political capital here. She was on the board, the MTA board of Los Angeles, so the planners went in there and they had these nice shiny plans and designs for this new TOD. And right away, since she had a lot of experience working in this community, she actually used to be the city council member for this district, and she was a community activist in East Los Angeles before she became a politician. You know, she kind of saw through all that as kind of an elaborate plan to displace the neighborhood and lead to gentrification. So she almost single-handedly, you know, stopped that and made the planners go back and to the drawing board and draw up a plan that was more conducive to the neighborhood characteristics and the people that actually lived in that community. So that's an example of political capital. The other example from political capital is all these different council members that have represented this neighborhood. They've all been Latino politicians who have seen it kind of in their best interest to keep the community Latino. So you have Ed Reyes, who just stepped down recently. He's actually a planner trained at UCLA. So he's not only a politician, but he has kind of the planning background. One key thing that they did was they started a day labor center near the TOD as well. Okay, so I'm not going to get into too much of that detail, but if you want to read about that, you can actually read my book. But that's kind of a fascinating. It's one of the key day labor centers in all of the United States. Okay, and so they're the city council member. Instead of, you know, getting rid of the day laborers like they usually do, it's, you know, they try to kind of collaborate with them and formalize some of the informality. F. Reyes and his staff really fought for affordable housing. So in LA, the city council members have land use authority when a developer wants to go and change some of the codes and so forth. So every time they did that, he was really pushing for more affordable housing in the neighborhood. His staff was doing that as well. City Councilman Mike Hernandez, he was the council member before Ed Reyes, and he really advocated for street vendors. I'll get into some of those details, and then I want to talk about, in terms of political capital, the immigrant rights public rallies that happened in MacArthur Park. The street vending district is an interesting story. So MacArthur Park is one of the centers in Los Angeles that had a lot of street vending. Okay, there's hundreds of street vendors there, and the usual response of cities to street vending is that you know, they want to get rid of it. And what they did in MacArthur Park is they did something different. Now, I would say that this is before the TOD, but it still very much relates to it, because the TOD plans had been in place since the 1980s. So you have to look at this TOD as kind of a piece of the other revitalization that's happening in the neighborhood. Okay, so they started a street vending district. That means that the street vendors could now have permits and they could sell their goods out in the park, and the police wouldn't harass them, and it'd be safer, you know, to eat the food because it's regulated, and so forth. Unfortunately, it was discontinued because there was too much bureaucracy associated with that program. But now there's renewed talks in LA about creating more street vending districts. So I think they could learn a lot from some of the lessons that the planners learned in formalizing the street vending. They also worked a lot with community-based organizations. This one is Mama's Hot Tamales. They started, they were a restaurant, but they were also like a kitchen incubator where the street vendors, and you can see the cart here, it's very kind of colorful, kind of a cultural, you know, Latino cart. The Mama's Hot Tamales would provide the kitchen incubator. They'd work with the city and the health department to try to figure out how to, you know, how to maneuver the bureaucracy. And I'm just noticing, actually, if you look through the window here, you see it says re-elect Ed Reyes. So it's interesting. They had a lot of connections with City Hall. They also had a lot of connections with the LAPD, and the LAPD is also part of this revitalization story here. But that's one kind of key lesson here is when we're dealing with these especially in Latino communities when there's a lot of informality happening that relates to the financial cultural capital, the financial capital that I'm also going to discuss. It's kind of important to kind of to do things a little bit different. The other form of immigrant political capital is really embedded in the public space of MacArthur Park itself. Okay, so it's MacArthur Park is a site of a lot of immigrant rights rallies in LA. In fact, the large immigrant rights rallies that have happened in MacArthur Park, a lot of them have ended in MacArthur. I'm sorry, they started in downtown LA and they go through downtown LA and then they end in MacArthur Park, because it is like this public space that's there, and then it becomes a space of activism. And I think that's something to really kind of keep in mind too when you're trying to understand this community. The other form of resistance here is kind of the placemaking that occurs in the park. And you'll see this in the Fruitvale example as well. Okay, so here in MacArthur Park, you have a lot of cultural celebrations, a lot of parades that are associated with like Independence Day in Central America, or other important kind of cultural festivals that are brought from Central America to MacArthur Park, and they bring in a lot of a lot of activities to the community. I'll also talk about how public space is transformed into this active space. Like in Latino communities, many times public spaces is very active space. It's not a very passive space. And then I'm going to give you a quick example of the Oscar Romero Plaza. So we're talking about cultural capital as placemaking. Okay, this is a quote from one of the people I interviewed. He's saying that for Central Americans, MacArthur Park is the Central American capital of the world, because there is no real capital in Central America, a region composed of 7 countries, so Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. But here in Los Angeles, you find the Central American capital of the world as a living community, okay, including Garífunas, which are African descendants in Central America. Okay, so it's really, you have to start, in order to really understand these neighborhoods, you have to really understand how they serve as this like cultural kind of milieu for the people that are in these neighborhoods. And I've actually looked at some of the transnational connections. That's getting a little bit away from the TOD thing, but if you really want to understand these communities, you also have to understand the transnational connections that exist in these areas. This is another quote from the interviewee. Now, my job was to hold cultural events in the park. So you're bringing in something that they're familiar with in their homelands, and really try to have this overall type feeling that people come to stroll through the park to enjoy tamale or raspada or whatever they are selling, to be able to sit in the park and enjoy entertainment from their country. So Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and try to keep their roots in Latin America. So I think this is important to understand, like even for transportation planners, if you're trying to work in these neighborhoods, there are kind of cultural things that you could also do and support. This relates to public spaces in the community. In MacArthur Park, this used to be a very passive type of park, and what the planners did is they worked with the community to kind of formalize it a little bit and make it more active, but at the same time, there was a lot of historical preservationists that didn't want to, for example, create these soccer fields. So then they had to reach an agreement where, on the books, this is not considered a soccer field; it's considered a meadow. But in reality, they do have this like, it is a soccer field, and so it's interesting, these kind of examples also that come from this neighborhood. Okay, my last example of placemaking is this Monsignor Oscar Romero Plaza, and again here you can see the TOD in the background. What's interesting here is that the initial plans of the TOD were actually supposed to go underneath the park and come out here, but anyways, the Oscar Romero was Archbishop of El Salvador. He was killed during the civil rights, human rights movements that happened in El Salvador, and so there was a lot of community kind of organizing and to work with the city and the planners to build this plaza for him. Before, the only statue in MacArthur Park was the statue of Douglas MacArthur, the general. So this kind of also shows how the community is starting to transform the neighborhood. These are other examples of placemaking, okay, actual physical examples of the community. This bike shop is just down the street from the TOD, actually. And this is just a kind of a picture showing you of some of the, how beautiful MacArthur Park is, actually. Okay, let's get into the Fruitvale and into that case. And again, I've talked about political capital and cultural capital so far. So here I want to talk about how political capital played out in the Fruitvale. So the Unity Council, like I said, opposed the initial plans. Okay, so they did a combination of gaining community input and participation, collaborating with local officials, and using federal connections to help secure funding for the support. I think that's really key. Like, Arabella Martinez was the CEO of the Unity Council. She formerly worked for President Carter's administration, so she had a lot of federal connections. And she was able to rely on those connections to bring funding into the project and bring just political support into the project as well. So you weren't really dealing like with a normal community development person. You were dealing with someone that started off as a community activist, then went to the federal government, and then kind of came back and used her connections to really push the project. Another key person here is Ignacio de la Fuente. He was a council member who made this project like a shiny project. And he had to just deal with a lot of like political kind of backlash because a lot of his funding, a lot of the city's funding was going into the Fruitvale Village instead of going into other neighborhoods. So again, if you talk about equity issues, yeah, you could highlight the Fruitvale Village as an equity issue, but then you also have to think about the other neighborhoods too, right? So that's kind of a problem. We'll get into some financial capital. I think like the biggest impact that the TOD has had is actually been on International Boulevard. I didn't go into the project kind of understanding that, but it was kind of a clear finding for me. International Boulevard is the center of the neighborhood, has a lot of Latino businesses there, and then it's really been revitalized as the TOD has really been able to open up the passage between the BART station through the TOD into a new mercado that the Unity Council also built, and then connected with all these with International Boulevard. The Unity Council also started a business improvement district, which was it's been a huge kind of hit. It's been able to support a lot of the emerging businesses in the area. And the merchants actually tax themselves, and then they use that funding for a lot of physical improvements, but also a lot of education around business development. The cultural placemaking that has occurred, like it was interesting because I first looked at Fruitvale as a Latino community, but then as I got more into the research, I realized that it was more multicultural, and that's reflected in the design. I spoke to the architect, and he said, yeah, we didn't just want to show it as a Latino kind of architecture, but we actually wanted to build more of a multi-ethnic kind of feel in the neighborhood. But you can see here that's the church, St. Elizabeth Cathedral. So in the design, they wanted to have that paseo where you can actually look through the station all the way to the church. The church is like this very important icon in the community. They also have festivals like in MacArthur Park. The Dia de los Muertos is one of their key festivals that they have. Okay, so this is a kind of a long quote, but it's a really interesting quote because I went into this project thinking of equity in a different way, and then one of the key leaders in this whole story kind of made me reshape my thinking around equity. So I want to read this real quick. So okay, so she's saying, I'm trying to broaden your definition of equity. Like for example, equity is having wonderful facilities for poor people. Equity is having really good parks and recreational facilities, okay? Equity is about having your streets cleaned regularly, and so in terms of commercial and retail, it means that people have more, a greater diversity of goods and services. And there is more competition because there are more stores. Okay? They don't have to go out of the neighborhood to shop. And many of these are minority-owned establishments. So if kids can play in the park instead of the streets, because before it was safer for them to play in the streets than in the parks because of gang, that's equity. So you have to have new parks, you have to have new schools, you have to have new medical facilities, new senior centers, new childcare facilities, you name it. And that was not resulted, at least, as far as I can see, in people being pushed out of the Fruitvale. And the other part of it, I guess, people are safer. I mean, not only are the streets cleaner, but they're safer. There's still crime, but Oakland is full of crime in the Flatlands. So I think on balance, I would say on the equity situation, I think we did very well. So that's kind of how they were framing equity in terms of this whole, this whole process. The other element here, and actually the book I want to write is going to be on Latinas and how they protect these barrios, because that's one of the key themes that has emerged here is this gender issue of a lot of the leaders in this whole story have been Latinas. So that's something I want to really get in deeper with. Okay, so in conclusion, I have a couple of ways to move forward here. I have 3 kind of recommendations. So the first one is that TOD projects need to support the endogenous forms of cultural, political, and financial capital that exist in these neighborhoods. Okay, so as a transportation planner, you don't just use, you figure out the numbers and then and do your plans without really understanding what's going on in these neighborhoods. And these are just some examples of what happened in MacArthur Park and Fruitvale related to really understanding these dynamics that exist in these communities. The second thing is that TOD projects need to rely more on bottom-up participatory forms of decision-making and actually embrace like the activism that occurs in the neighborhood, especially if you're dealing with issues of potential gentrification and displacement. I think the activists, I mean, that they're really in tune with that agenda, so they're actually going to be kind of pushing for whatever mediation that can happen around that issue. And these are examples in the neighborhood of that thing. And in terms of outcomes, I think these are the 4 key kind of issues that I've seen in both of these projects. The first thing is affordable housing. It was like the key, kind of issue that, that most of the activists and the local politicians were concerned about, and that's because of the potential risk of gentrification. Opening up regional public transport, is if you incorporate and support increase to this, encouraging diverse small businesses was key. That's especially true in the Fruitvale, but in MacArthur Park, I mean, if you just go to that neighborhood, there's hundreds of very kind of, very vibrant Latino small businesses in these areas. And the social services is interesting because in the Fruitvale was an entire package of social services that were provided, and that's why it was so the project needed a lot of subsidies. MacArthur Park actually has all these services, but it's done in a much more informal way. Okay, it's like these, for example, the medical services. There's so many medical services there that are run by Latino doctors and so forth. So all these services actually exist in MacArthur Park, but they just exist in a different way. Okay, and just to conclude, like I said, this is an unfinished product so far. I still have these other 2 case studies that I'm studying, and hopefully I could write a book about all of these. So I would be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we have a question here. In your experience, what are the types of outreach efforts that work best in helping the Latino community absorb the issues and helps them feel empowered to speak, attend, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Okay, so first I'll focus on what I saw in these case studies, and then other work I've done. So in the Fruitvale, I thought, especially when it was focused on the business improvement district, I was able to interact with their outreach coordinator there, and she's a bilingual, bicultural person. I think she works full time on this, and she basically goes around business to business, and and does very personal, one-on-one type of outreach, and then she'll bring in the education piece and so forth. So that's kind of one model that's very, it's very kind of one-to-one type of model. In MacArthur Park, I think the actual outreach there was interesting. It was very political. Like a lot of the activist organizations, I didn't have time to get into it, but they put a lot of pressure on the local politicians. And so, like for example, they did a survey of the people in the neighborhood about, what the key issues were that they wanted to tackle, and the key issue was affordable housing. So that kind of validated a lot of, a lot of the interest around affordable housing. They took that, they had a public forum where they brought in a lot of the Latino residents, and they brought in the planners, and they brought in the local politicians, and they presented the findings of the survey. That's another model. That's, I think, more kind of political / planning. And then what I've done a lot more work on public participation in my other, projects. And right now I'm working with this project I started here called the Latino Civic Participation Project in Oregon. And mostly I'm working with undocumented Latinos, and it's very difficult to do kind of public engagement with that population because they're afraid to interact with planners and because they might get deported. So the way I do it is, I teamed up with James Rojas, who does these very engaging, like fun and non-coercive public engagement workshops. And so I figured out, okay, how do you tap into these? How do you create safe spaces for these populations to, to be able to interact with and share their ideas? So we do them through schools, we do them through community-based organizations. We actually work with Latino small businesses, and we go into the businesses and we interact with people there. We do them at cultural fairs. So I think there's different ways of doing it. There's not like one kind of recipe way of doing public engagement, but it is a very difficult thing to do.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. People, if you have questions, you haven't submitted them, feel free to type those into the questions pane while Gerardo's answering these other questions here. The next question is, did you examine land use and/or affordable housing policies in each city? If so, then what role did the policies play in producing successful projects?
Yeah, I think it was more a piecemeal, to be honest, and more like opportunistic. Like in LA, for example, a lot of the affordable, a lot of the projects actually came really from the pressure that the community exerted on the local city council's office. And then the city council's office, like I mentioned, had land use jurisdiction over their own council seat, and so they were able to pressure those developers into them providing the affordable housing. So it wasn't, and then you have that's one way of getting a lot of affordable housing in the neighborhood. The other one is more through the TODs, and I think those are more kind of high. They're more they're projects that are, I guess, more expensive. They're kind of highlight projects, that then politicians can then point to and say, okay, we're doing these really nice TODs in these areas. But in terms of a comprehensive affordable housing policy, I haven't really seen that.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, can you talk about the land ownership for each case study, and if that affected the end result, how were the property owners involved or convinced?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's a great question, because I'll speak to MacArthur Park. Well, I mean, the landowners in the Fruitvale, I mean, they're the Unity Council kind of took the lead on that. So, but in LA, I think it's the MacArthur Park is a little more complex. So in MacArthur Park, the MTA initially had bought the site. Yeah, let me show you real quick. If I go, it might help if I have a little map. Well, anyways, if you remember the site of the TOD, the MTA actually had plans to take over two blocks of the eastern part of the park, but when they spoke to the landowners didn't actually want to sell. Like the price that they were willing to, the MTA was willing to pay for it, according to the landowners, wasn't justified. And it's an interesting question, because in many ways, if you look at these buildings, like they kind of look, from the outside, they kind of look run down, not very well kept. But really, the landowners are profiting quite a bit from the type of immigrant, informal economy that exists in the community. And so I think the real price of acquiring that land is, it wasn't up to par for those landowners. And the landowners, a lot of them are, I think are not really in tune with revitalizing the neighborhood. I think they're kind of there just to kind of make a profit, to be blunt.
Mhm. And then the last question we have here is, could you talk about the applicability of what you found to other either Latino communities or other communities and TODs in Oregon or elsewhere beyond the areas you looked?
Yeah, so that's another good question. So in many ways, I do very deep kind of context-dependent case studies. So in one way, one answer would be, okay, they're really hard to kind of replicate because you're not going to have like an Arabella Martinez, in every Latino community. Someone that has all those federal connections, and state connections, and can draw those connections and so forth, right? So, or like in MacArthur Park, you're not going to have a neighborhood that has, all the, that level of immigrant population or all those Latino businesses that you can actually kind of, tap into and improve and use as a resource and so forth. So what so to answer your question, it's actually, well, let me set it up by throwing something else out there too. A lot of the research that I do in Oregon, I'm realizing that a lot of these characteristics that exist in these other immigrant Latino neighborhoods don't exist here. So Latinos here don't have political capital. Many times they have some financial capital, but they're being like, they don't. Basically, these characteristics don't exist. So in a way, if I had to give like a recommendation in terms of how to replicate this stuff, I would say that look for these endogenous forms of resources, right, and capitals and so forth, and try to build upon those. And if they exist, then you're ahead of the game because it's going to make it a lot easier for you. Now, if they don't exist, then as a planner, I think you're going to have to do some community development work and try to build those endogenous forms of capacity in these neighborhoods. And then, one way of doing it is, through public participation. I mean, that's kind of that's one way of getting at this. Another way is I have this project here in Oregon where I'm looking at Latino small businesses, and many times these businesses just kind of, they do it themselves. They don't rely on government resources or anything. So really the key thing is just to make these regulations a little bit more lax so that so that they can actually thrive on their own. Maybe provide some loans and so forth. So that's it's a hard question to answer, but I think you can't replicate this stuff. But if you're in a neighborhood that has a lot more of this capacity, then I think you're kind of ahead of the game. And if you're not, then you're gonna have to build some of this capacity yourself.
Great. Well, with that, we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. And thanks again for Dr. Sandoval for sharing your work. We're looking for your feedback so that we can continue to offer relevant webinars in the future, so please be on the lookout for an email with a short evaluation survey. You can view other professional development offerings and find more about the research discussed today on our website, nitc.us. This concludes the webinar. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.